They say emperors could take anything they wanted, but Nero wanted something far more disturbing. Imagine a young boy, no older than 16, dragged before the emperor in the dead of night. The palace torches flicker, the marble floors echo, and every guard turns their eyes away, because they all know what's happening is forbidden, even for Nero. The boy looks up terrified and sees Nero studying his face with a strange, unsettling calm. Not anger, not lust, but recognition. Because in that moment, Nero wasn't looking at the boy. He was looking at the ghost of his dead wife. And he whispered the words that sealed the boy's fate forever. You will replace her. There are moments in history that feel less like recorded events and more like the shadowed corners of a fever dream, stories whispered through marble corridors, where truth bends under the weight of power and human lives are reshaped by the desires of a single man. And in the final years of Emperor Nero's rule, Rome became a theater of such unsettling transformations, a place where grief twisted into obsession and obsession into something far stranger than anyone dared to speak aloud. If you enjoy this dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you are watching from. I'm genuinely curious to know where this story reached. The story begins on a quiet evening in Rome, long after the sun had sunk behind the Palatine Hill. The city still hummed, as Rome always did, but inside the palace the atmosphere had changed. The torches burned lower. The servants spoke softer. There was a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with smoke or summer heat. It came from the emperor himself. Nero had lost the woman he loved, Poppaea Sabina. Whatever history says about her ambitions or her influence, one thing is certain. Her absence carved something hollow inside him. Those near him described a strange stillness that settled over his face, as though he were staring at a world only he could see. Meals went untouched. Music no longer interested him. Nights passed without sleep. The emperor, once unpredictable but vibrant, had grown eerily quiet. But grief in Nero's hands didn't fade. It transformed. At first, the palace assumed he would remarry. That was the Roman way. Emperors did not remain widowers for long. Matches would be proposed, alliances calculated, bloodlines improved. But Nero refused every suggestion, every name, every negotiation. He dismissed the matter entirely, as though the very idea of replacing Poppaea was insulting to him. And then, one evening, he asked for something unexpected. He wanted to walk among the people. It wasn't unusual for Roman rulers to disguise themselves and roam the streets at night, but Nero had stopped this habit long ago. His grief had kept him inside the palace walls, until now. He put on a simple cloak, tied the hood over his head, ordered a small escort of guards to keep distance, and slipped into the dimly lit streets of the capital. The guards followed at a respectful distance, but even from afar they could sense something strange in the way Nero moved. His steps were slow, his head tilted at odd angles as though he were studying shadows rather than people. His breathing was uneven. It was the walk of a man searching for something he couldn't name. He wandered through the marketplace, now half asleep for the night, past bakeries, taverns, and the steps of temples. But then he stopped in front of a modest household courtyard where a small gathering had formed. There was laughter inside, not loud but warm. A family dinner, perhaps. A simple moment, something Nero no longer possessed. And in that courtyard there was a child. A boy perhaps 9 or 10 years old, standing under a lantern's glow, holding what looked like a small lyre. The instrument was much too large for his hands, yet he held it carefully, as though it were precious. He didn't look extraordinary, not in the way royalty did. Yet there was something unmistakable about him. Something in the softness of his face, the delicate lines of his nose, the brightness in his eyes. Nero stopped breathing. The guards noticed too late. He stepped forward as if pulled by a force outside himself. His hood slipped back, revealing his identity. The family froze. The boy lowered his lyre, confused more than afraid. And the emperor just stared. No one will ever know exactly what Nero saw in that moment. But the palace storytellers whispered one terrifying explanation. The boy looked like Poppaea. Not perfectly, not identically, but enough. Enough to stir something inside a grieving emperor whose mind had been drifting between memory and delusion for months. Enough to make him step forward. Enough for the family to fall to their knees in terror. And enough to seal the boy's fate. The guard commander moved quickly, sensing danger in the emperor's expression. He approached Nero and asked if they should escort him back to the palace. Nero did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on the child, and then, In a voice quiet but unmistakably final, he said, "Bring him to me." This was not a request. It was a decree. The family panicked. The mother begged. The father tried to explain that the boy was frail, that he was shy, that he had nothing to offer. But it didn't matter. In Rome, especially under Nero, protest only tightened the noose. The boy was taken. Not violently, not with spectacle, just quietly, efficiently. As though he were being carried out of one world and into another, with no idea what waited for him behind the palace walls. His name was Sporus. In the early days, Sporus wandered the palace like a ghost. Servants avoided looking at him for too long, as though proximity might place them in danger. The corridors were lined with statues, each more imposing than the last, and the boy moved between them silently, unsure where he was allowed to step or breathe. Nero, meanwhile, drifted in and out of his presence like a storm. Some days he approached Sporus with a strange gentleness, asking him questions, complimenting the softness of his features, offering him fine robes. Other days Nero watched him from a distance, eyes narrowed, lost in some private memory. The palace whispers grew louder. Nero had found a replacement, not for a servant, not for a companion, but for Poppaea herself. Sporus became the center of the emperor's attention. His hair was styled like hers. His clothing resembled hers. Everything about him was shaped to mirror the woman Nero had lost. The transformation was gradual enough to avoid panic, but deliberate enough that the entire palace felt a chill settle over them. Rome had always known strange emperors, but this was different. This was a man resculpting reality to soothe the grief that had hollowed him from the inside. Still, Sporus was only a child. He didn't understand why he was being dressed in silks, why perfumed attendants fussed over him, why Nero grew distant whenever Sporus laughed, because Poppaea had laughed like that too. He didn't know why the emperor avoided any mention of her name, yet surrounded the boy with everything she once touched. Nero's obsession deepened. He began taking Sporus with him everywhere, public ceremonies, musical performances, private banquets. The senators felt uncomfortable. The Praetorian guards muttered beneath their breath, but no one dared ask questions. Rome had learned long ago that Nero's grief had no boundaries and his anger had no predictable triggers. But obsession never stays still. Over time, Nero's fixation darkened. His gaze lingered too long. His compliments grew stranger, almost ritualistic. He began speaking to Sporus as though they shared memories that never belonged to the boy. In private moments, Nero would stare at him with a desperate tenderness that made even the bravest servants uneasy. The palace had become a place of rehearsed smiles, forced laughter, and the quiet dread of those who understood the emperor's state of mind. The musicians practiced music Nero once enjoyed, because playing anything new risked reminding him that time was still moving forward. The servants moved carefully, whispering warnings to each other not to startle him, not to mention Poppaea, not to question the boy's presence. And Sporus continued growing. The older he became, the more he resembled Poppaea, not entirely, but enough for Nero's illusion to remain intact. Enough to make the emperor sink deeper into the fantasy he built. Enough that the whispers of Rome began drifting through the palace gates. People asked, "Who is this boy? Why does the emperor look at him like that? Why does he dress him the way he does?" But the question no one dared say aloud was the one everyone feared. What has Nero done? Still, Sporus adapted. Children bend with the wind where adults break. He learned how to walk softly, how to answer the emperor's questions gently, and how to avoid anything that triggered Nero's spiraling moods. He learned the layout of the palace better than his own childhood home. And in the quietest moments he wondered whether his parents still lit a lantern for him, praying he might return. The answer would never matter. Nero never intended to let him go. The illusion Nero created reached its apex on a warm spring evening. Rome had gathered for a ceremonial event, something grand, theatrical, meant to display the emperor's presence after months of seclusion. Senators arrived in embroidered robes. The Praetorians lined the marble steps. Musicians tuned their instruments to a soft, reverent hum. And then the palace doors opened. What emerged silenced the entire courtyard. Sporus stepped into view, dressed not as a child, not as a servant, but in garments unmistakably modeled after Poppaea's ceremonial attire. The silk shimmered under the torchlight. Gold threads traced delicate patterns across the hem. His hair, carefully styled, framed his face exactly the way hers once had. Behind him, Nero walked with an expression caught somewhere between triumph and sorrow. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him forward with the gentleness one reserves for someone irreplaceable. No one dared breathe. In that moment, the entire Roman elite understood what they had whispered but never confirmed. Nero had not replaced Poppaea with another woman. He had replaced her with Sporus. The emperor gave a speech, long, poetic, full of metaphors about rebirth, beauty, the return of harmony. But no one heard the words. They only saw the boy standing beside him, trembling slightly, eyes cast downward as though afraid of the weight of hundreds of stairs. The event ended in a stunned quiet. No applause, no murmurs. Just the unsettling sense that the empire had crossed into a realm where power was no longer political, but deeply psychological. The following months were a blur of performances, feasts, and public appearances where Sporus remained an ever-present figure. Nero's unstable affection alternated between gentle protectiveness and frantic need. Some days he treated the boy like a cherished companion. Other days he retreated into long episodes of silence, staring into corners of the room as though haunted by the ghost of his wife. It was during this time that Rome began to fracture. Rebellions sparked. Provinces grew restless. The Senate shifted uneasily. Generals whispered of replacement. The empire was unraveling, thread by thread, while Nero cocooned himself inside his fantasy, shielding himself from the world that was turning against him. And Sporus? He watched the cracks widen. He learned that even emperors couldn't escape consequences, that the higher the throne, the more violent the fall. And when that fall finally came, when Nero fled Rome as the Senate declared him an enemy, Sporus was by his side, frightened, yet uncertain whether he was fleeing with the emperor or being carried by the current of Nero's delusion. In the final hours of Nero's life, the palace remained silent. No crowds, no servants. Just a handful of loyalists and a boy who had been stolen from his family to fill a void that could never be filled. History records Nero's end in various ways, some embellished, others conflicting. But one detail appears again and again. Sporus was there. When Nero took his final breath, the fantasy ended. The illusion shattered, and the boy who had lived in the emperor's shadow found himself suddenly alone, untethered from the role forced upon him. But Rome wasn't finished with him. The new rulers knew who Sporus was, what Nero had turned him into. And instead of freeing him or returning him to his family, they recycled him into another twisted form of entertainment, another political mockery, another symbol of Rome's fractured morality. Sporus became a living reminder of Nero's madness, paraded and humiliated by those who wished to erase the old emperor by degrading what he had valued. His life became a quiet tragedy, not defined by violence, but by loss. Loss of identity, loss of childhood, loss of any chance to choose what he would become. And as history continued moving, emperors rose and fell, wars were fought and forgotten, and Rome itself shifted into new eras. Yet the story of Sporus survived in hushed corners of ancient texts, a disturbing footnote in the life of a ruler, whose grief had warped into obsession, dragging an innocent boy into the orbit of an empire's darkest shadows. Nero believed he could bring back the woman he lost. He believed that beauty could replace memory, that a child could mirror a ghost, that power could bend reality. But in the end, he left behind a tragedy that outlived him, a tragedy not of bloodshed or battle, but of identity taken and reshaped by an emperor who refused to let go. Sporus entered the palace as a boy with a lyre in his hands. He left it as a symbol of one of Rome's most unsettling stories, and to this day historians still struggle to define him. A victim? A companion? A prisoner of grief? Or simply a child who became the reflection of an emperor's madness? Whatever the answer, one thing remains certain. Some of the darkest moments in history are not marked by violence, but by the quiet and calm remaking of a life, reshaped in the image of someone else's sorrow.